Today, the budget crawler gets an Aussie locker. There's a lot of options out there in the world of differential lockers, but just to keep this nice and short, we went with the Aussie locker because it's one of the cheaper options and it's one of the more simple, reliable options. Now this is an automatic locker, an auto locker, so we have no control over whether the differential is locked or not. It's basically always going to be locked as long as there's power applied to it, which isn't the end of the world, but we're definitely giving up some convenience by going with an automatic locker rather than a selectable locker. Now we're still running factory axles on this TJ, which means we have a Dana 30 up front, specifically a low pinion Dana 30, and a Dana 35 in the rear. Now most of us know that the rear Dana 35 is kind of a ticking time bomb in that it's not a very strong axle, and once we start using and abusing it, it's more than likely going to fail, and I have experienced that firsthand. With that being said, we got the Aussie locker to go in the front Dana 30 only. I'm not going to put anything in the rear right now because I don't want to overstress that Dana 35 any more than I have to, since we're already running 33-inch tires, which are definitely pushing the axle with the type of wheeling that I plan on doing with this thing. And as a side note, we will eventually be upgrading the rear axle, but for now we're going to run with the Dana 35. So let's talk about the locker here. It is now made in the USA. I think they used to be made in Australia, and they're definitely proud that it's made in the USA, as they should be. And this is basically what it consists of. It's just a really small, tight package, and I mean, there's not a whole lot of parts in here. We've got 6 major components total, and then a few springs and pins, and that's about it. So this is a super simple locker, proven itself to be very reliable, and we'll surely be putting it to the test. So let's get this thing installed. I was hoping we'd be able to do this by leaving the whole carrier here in the vehicle, because according to Aussie locker's instructions there, if this pin can slide out of the carrier with the ring gear installed, then the carrier does not need to be removed. But if the pin can't come out with the ring gear installed, then the whole carrier needs to come out, and that's the case here. Everything was going fine up until this point. In fact, I'd say it was going pretty well. But if we look here, you see the bearings on both sides of this carrier aren't quite the same. See all those little round cylinders in the bottom of the pan over here? Well, when I went to clean up the carrier, I literally tapped the cage holding all these roller bearings with my pinky, and the whole bearing fell apart. So basically that bearing was shot, and I didn't realize it. And you can kind of see all the pitting along the inner race right here. All the roller bearings were also pitted, and there is just no way that this bearing could be reused or should be reused. So at this point, I had a couple options. I could either replace the bearing, or I could just replace the axle, which I probably will eventually anyway. So after some long, hard thinking, I just decided to go ahead and replace the bearing, and that's what we're going to do now. We got this thing all set up with a bearing separator. The inner race still was not wanting to come off, so we applied a little heat, and there we go. Now, if you ever find yourself needing to set up gears or replace a bearing like this, I highly suggest making a set of setup bearings, and that's what I'm doing right here. Basically, I'm just taking a, I guess it's a flap wheel kind of thing that's on the cordless drill, and sanding out the center of a bearing so that it will slide on and off the carrier easily, so we can figure out our shim spacing. We don't need to continually press our new bearing on and off, because that will likely eventually destroy it. Now, long story short, I basically had to remove a shim or two behind the bearing compared to what was there before in order to make this carrier fit back in here properly. And I think that's probably due to the fact that it's a different brand bearing than the bearing that was originally in here. So we went ahead and checked the gear pattern, and then I checked the backlash, which you can see right now, and we were pretty much within spec for a well-worn set of gears with 200,000 miles on them. Now, if things weren't in spec, we would have had to pull the pinion, had to pull the other carrier bearing, adjust shims, and it would have been a whole mess, so we kind of lucked out on this one. Now, you can also see my homemade differential case spreader here. I'm not going to talk too much about that in this video. If you guys are interested, I can do a whole other video just on that. Basically, I had to bust that thing out because at one point I jammed the carrier in here with a few too many shims, and that was pretty much the only way to get it back out again. So with our shim situation all figured out, let's go ahead and get the final bearing pressed on. Alright, now we're finally back to where we should have been a few hours ago. So we'll go ahead and pull off the ring gear here. You'll notice a little paint mark on there. I marked where it was so that it can go back on the exact same place. Then we punched out the cross pin and pulled out the spider gears, making sure to keep all of the original spacers or shims with the gears that came out. Went ahead and threw the Aussie locker components in, checked clearances per the Aussie locker instructions, so they have a specified number that it needs to meet, and that's what I did there. Now this really isn't an instructional video, and I don't intend it to be, because I basically just followed the generic instructions that everyone else on the internet outlines when they install one of these. However, one thing that I did do differently comes to these little pins and springs. There are 4 of them that go around the locker. Most people say to use some grease and some other stuff and whatever to hold them in place, but I found it easier to install all of these after the major components were installed, rather than having to deal with them and have it be one more thing that we have to keep track of as we're shoving all these components in there. So basically, once the major components were in, we were able to slide these little pins in, and then I used a little screwdriver to get the springs to seat in there, and that seemed to be the easiest method for me. But on the note of instructions, down in the description below, I'll put a link to what I think are a pretty good set of instructions by 4x4explorer.com. And if you're going to install one of these, I would suggest reading through those instructions as well as the instructions that come with the locker. There we go. Locker is all installed. Probably got a couple hundred miles on the road on it at this point. I haven't noticed any difference in handling. The only thing I've noticed is a little bit of a click like that when we go around tight corners and parking lots. Haven't noticed it on the road. But yeah, it should have been a pretty simple install. The only thing that made it a little more challenging was the bearing that we had to replace, but other than that, I'd say it wasn't too bad. It took about a day total, and luckily I had all the tools and the parts on hand in order to change out that bearing because I'm planning on a re-gear in the future. So that worked out pretty well, and I think this is going to give us a pretty good improvement in off-road traction. Now, one other thing you'll notice here is we're no longer running the stock diff cover. I didn't bother putting the stock one back on. I went ahead and installed an upgraded diff cover, which will give us better protection against the rocks. This one in particular is a Poison Spider Bombshell cover. The reason I went with this one is because it's one of the few that claims it will work with a stock height vehicle, which this Jeep essentially is stock height. It's all stock suspension still. The problem with most aftermarket diff covers is that they stick out further than the factory diff cover and end up having interference problems with the track bar. This diff cover is supposed to be low profile enough that we won't have any issues, and hopefully we won't. And with that, let's see how much we spent today. Our previous total was just under $3,600, so today we added the Aussie locker for $220.99. If I remember correctly, I bought that on eBay on a 15% off day. Now, I've mentioned this in the past, but every once in a while, eBay has a day where everything on their site is 15% off. You use their coupon code. It happens a couple times a year, and I usually save up a bunch of things that I want to buy and then wait until one of those days comes up, and I'll buy a whole bunch of stuff. And I think that was one of them. Carrier bearings, $38.26. Those are just basically based on the replacement cost of those. Like I said, I picked up all the parts I needed to re-gear these axles, and that just came out of that supply, so it's going to cost $38.26 to replace both the bearing that I used and the bearing that I ground down to use as a setup bearing. Then we had gear oil. Obviously, we needed to refill the differential once we put the cover back on. And speaking of the cover, we used that Bombshell differential cover. That was $80.99. I think I bought that off Northridge 4x4. And if you remember a few episodes back when I bought the winch from there, I said that I got a $75 gift card for spending a bunch of money there. It was basically a promotion they were running at the time, which brought that diff cover down to $5.99 by using that. So that was a pretty good deal. And then on top of that, we had to paint the diff cover because, of course, I didn't want to spend the extra $10 or $15 to buy the powder-coated version. I just used $4 worth of paint and a bunch of my time instead. All right, our total for the build to date is now $3,862.47, and that includes the purchase price of the vehicle. And those of you who have been watching for a few episodes will remember that we have a rough $5,000 budget we want to keep this build within. We're getting pretty close there now. We've got about $1,200 more to play with. And let's think about what else we're going to need on this Jeep. The thing that really comes to mind for me is armor. So we're going to need some rock rails. I want to upgrade the gas tank skid plate, and I still need to build a skid plate under the transmission transfer case assembly since we got rid of the stock skid plate there. And as far as I can think, that's really all we're going to need. There are certainly things that would be good to do and maybe should be done. Namely upgrading the rear differential. The Dana 35 is a very big weak point on these Jeeps. I have broken them in the past, and I don't expect this one to hold up too well, but I may just push it and see how far we can take it. Sometimes they hold up well, sometimes they don't. It really depends on how you drive with them and how they've been treated in the past, I guess. But yeah, armor, I think, is the biggest thing we have left right now that we need to deal with on this Jeep. And I think that will pretty much bring it to a point where we can run the trails that I want to run. So stay tuned to see how we deal with all that. As usual, thank you for watching. Always appreciate a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. We'll see you on the next one.